podcast in the past. I thought it was a good one, but we both listened to it and we didn't like it, and we took it down. But maybe it was good. I don't know. Anyway, it's gone, and we haven't done a podcast for a long time.
Yeah, I think it was June last year, so almost a year.
No, I think we did one. We did one about the Home Depot, and maybe 6 months ago.
Okay, yeah, that's possible. Yeah. Speaking of the Home Depot, the book is finished.
The book is wonderful. I've got a copy for you.
Yeah.
Well, I have a copy for you, but I keep giving copies to other people.
Yeah. If there's one left for me, that's fine.
Oh, there will be.
Okay.
There will be. I just have to make them. You know, I make a couple, and then a couple people will get a copy, and then I got to make some more. But yeah, there'll be a copy.
Okay. So not all of the 50 copies are done yet.
No, it's still a lot of them. I would say maybe, yeah, probably more than 40 of them are still just in the pages. They're in plastic wrapped pages for each of the sections.
Okay.
So they're not folded. They're not sewn together. There's a bit of work to do.
And did you get some feedback already from the people that received the book?
Yes, I've gotten some wonderful feedback.
I mean, it's a wonderful short stories.
Yeah, it's I'm very happy with that book. It's such an interesting book because it was done so long ago and it didn't appear until 10 years later.
But also it doesn't really fit anymore. I mean, I think the Home Depot podcast was about the working class here. I think you called it. So but the short stories in there are basically not really don't resemble what you're working on these times.
What do you mean?
I think that the philosophy, the work, or whatever the projects you're working on, they're completely different from what these stories are about.
Yeah, I think the philosophical work, especially the work that you and I have been doing, is, research into spiritual matters and psychedelics and ego and virtue and all these, connectedness to stuff we're going to get into on this podcast. But yeah, driving a forklift at Home Depot is not really, it doesn't seem related, but
yeah, to a certain extent, it still is probably being a working class person and things like this. So it was basically an unfinished project which you wanted to finally finish.
Well, yeah, I always had the intention of making it a proper book after you encouraged me. Really, that's in the preface to the book. But it was your encouragement that finally had this book made. And I don't know if without your encouragement it would have appeared, but it did.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. I always like these stories. So I will pick up my copy as soon as possible. But you're working on something new, you told me.
Well, I was just talking about that podcast that we took down. There was one really interesting idea that came out of that, and I still think about it. We were at some point we're discussing Egypt and the technologies of Egypt, and particularly the one technology that we don't understand how they're able to move those 80-ton blocks up into the higher reaches of the pyramid. And we were basically saying, and I think maybe it was me or we were talking about that, how silly it is as Westerners that we are looking for the technological solution to how they did that within our technology and within our science, when the Egyptians were moving those blocks for spiritual reasons. It was technology that was guided by a question of the spirit, and that will be the unlocking of the mystery of that technology, is to understand the spiritual motivation for why those blocks needed to go where they needed to go. And I think that led to us talking about technologies that are guided by the Spirit, and how we live in a time where we don't ask a spiritual question of our technology. We don't create new technologies based on spiritual concerns. They're just based on capitalist concerns. Just more control. Why do people make an app? Why do people make these devices? Certainly not to benefit some spiritual quest.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, also the stones in Egypt are always the example I give to people when I talk about what I am thinking about, or reading about, or listening, or watching, because it shows the people that maybe there are some skills within the human being that are, for us Westerners, rational thinking, logical, technical, and scientific driven people, which are not understandable anymore. Actually, yesterday I was watching a documentary. It's called the DMT Quest. I have not told you about this. Of course, I mean, I watched it yesterday, and it was actually very interesting, because it tries to show that endogenous DMT, ever since 2000, we met in Colombia, I think it was in 2011. And back then we met in Cali, and when I went to Buga and you came to Buga, I think 2 or 3 weeks after me, when I was there alone in Buga, somebody asked me if I want to join an ayahuasca or a yage ceremony. And I come from this very conservative family, and I had no experience with any kinds of drugs. So I said no, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know. But ever since I was curious about this, and when I lost my soul, I think that was the topic of our first podcast, and I think I understand it now much more after doing all of the work in the last 9 months. I became more and more curious about ayahuasca and shamanism in general. But what I did not realize it is until I would say yesterday, when I saw this documentary, but even before that I was aware of the fact that probably DMT is part of a human being anyway. So it's an endogenous compound molecule within us anyway.
That's right.
But
we have small amounts of it in us already.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this chemical activity, including the DMT, can be triggered by certain things, and I think the Buddhist monks do it by meditation. The Indian yogis do it by doing extensive yoga. Some people go to the sweat lodge. Shamans do it by drinking ayahuasca or eating mushrooms or pain or whatever methods there are. But there, in this documentary, there is this Dutch guy. I heard the name before. I've never done any research about him. I think he's called the Iceman. He can tolerate ice cold water, and he's climbing up cold, very high mountains, almost naked, naked and things like this. But
Wim Hof?
Yeah, exactly. But the way he is achieving this is by proper breathing techniques, and he creates. By doing this, he creates a chemical activity in this body that gives him the skills to do all of these things, which are now 26 times in the Guinness Book of the World Records. And I think what the Egyptians did, probably more than any other civilization, their spiritual quest was basically finding out for thousands of years how to create a permanent, long-lasting spiritual activity that basically led to the building of structures which we don't understand how they built it or built them, but also these structures, as you said, were not a result of being spiritual. They were not only a result of being spiritual, they also served a spiritual purpose.
Well, I think it even goes deeper than that. We we're mistaken in our framework when we go to analyze these things. The anthropologists are wrong. For one thing, they can't understand the technology because they don't understand the spiritual concerns. But they also make the mistake when they look at the labor involved for building these things, and they assume that it was slaves building them.
Yeah, automatically.
And they assume this. They assume this because they say, why would anyone give their entire life to build a pyramid unless they were being paid? Because they first said you couldn't pay all the people enough money. It would never have worked economically. So they must be slaves. That's a silly assumption. What if there were real spiritual reasons for building the pyramid itself, becoming part of a monumental project and committing your life to something like that?
Yeah,
I mean, I don't...
Yeah, I totally agree. Especially the Egyptians saw, I think, the normal life here on this planet as a preparation for the afterlife. So why shouldn't this apply to the more average person and not only to the pharaoh?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just there's these assumptions that are made. They're extreme biases, fundamental biases, but you see these biases all the time playing out in Western life. One of the biggest biases is this concept of the individual, which has been created as a product of states, cities, and technologies that we use, and it's not apparent that in history the individual has always existed as we're talking about, in the last, number of thousands of years. The concept of identity and all these things. These are things people tend to think as being always there, and then analyzing history, looking back very far and thinking that these things would always be present and assume they would be present, but they're not present in the same way, and they may not even be present at all. That's some of the exciting stuff, is that we can look at Inuit, and we have these cultures that are certainly not Western, and they're certainly not agricultural, and they have not had city life and anything like we've known. And you can look and say, well, what is the concept of identity for these people? What, in their language, how do they talk about certain things? And there's a lot we can learn from that. But these anthropologists and people don't really do that. They're not interested in what these people have to say about their own lives. They're only interested in observing them and coming to their conclusions within an economic and philosophic framework, which is very biased to begin with. So we make the mistake with Egypt. It's a huge mistake. But we've made this mistake with so many people, even people that are alive today, cultures that are very different.
Okay, but you came across some anthropologists that were the complete opposite as well, right?
Well, I would say that, yeah, Knut Rasmussen he's not really an anthropologist, but that's probably why he was so good at what he did. All of the Inuit studies and all of the very early contact with Inuit, all of the stuff that we have is because of Knut Rasmussen, particularly all of the cultural items, the cultural things, because he was the only one really interested in the shamanism and the spiritual stuff and the poetry, and he that interested him a lot more than scientific and geographical studies. And he also could speak Inupiat fluently, so he was accepted. But it's interesting that we have this figure who's not an anthropologist and he's not a scientist. He actually had very little education. This is the guy that is the expert. Really, it's wonderful stuff.
Yeah, isn't it all many times like this that actually the non-experts are doing a much better job in finding out what is actually going on?
Well, it begins with those biases. He didn't really have those biases, and also he was willing to listen with an open mind to what people were saying and take them seriously. I always think back to the that there was the Northwest Passage that explorers were looking to navigate in the 19th century, and there were all these shipwrecks and people that tried to get through it. There was a famous one by two English boats, and they were both completely lost. And it was just in 2014 that they discovered where they were. But what's interesting is that to discover them, they talked finally to the Eskimos that were living in the region, who had songs about the exact location of the boats. Okay. So the Eskimos have known where the boats have been, where they sunk, because they've been singing about it. They sing their history, right?
Yeah.
And these songs have been passed down. but no one took them seriously. It's just ridiculous.
It's the same all the time. I mean, read books or read the book written by George Catlin, read or by Claude Lévi-Strauss. All of these people have some myths and legends, and everybody is just thinking, okay, these are just some fairy tales. But maybe there is some deep truth, very old truth maybe, behind all of these stories. They're singing, they are having in their poems or whatever. I mean, and maybe that's a very good way to preserve them, because language evolves over time, and maybe by preserving them in a sung way or in a poetic way, maybe the actual content of these words is not changing as much as it would change when it's just a normal story you tell your kids or whatever.
Yeah. We just, as Westerners, and I say, these scientists I'm speaking about, these anthropologists, they don't want to listen to what these people are telling them. It's just shocking to me. The book, Narby's book, gets into quite a bit.
He proved... But he proved that he can change. At the beginning he was completely I mean, this is why I like this. One reason why, there's multiple reasons why I love this book so much, but one reason why I like it so much, because he changed his way of thinking. So he adopted the way of thinking as the Amazonian Indians thought, and actually used their language. So he tried to understand them, not by translating it, but trying to look through their eyes and or listen with their ears. I found this a very interesting thing, actually, that the author or the anthropologist did not only observe them, but tried to understand them with the means they actually had.
Well, in getting into Narby, the interesting thing is, and he remarks about it, is we are willing to accept that these tribal people in the Amazon have discovered all of these medicines, and these medicines are effective, right? But then when you ask them, how do they figure out how you have to dig up this root and bring this thing over here and boil it?
Don't believe them anymore.
Do all these advanced things. When they ask them, how did they discover this? The answer is, the plants told me. The ayahuasca told me. And that the scientists reject. Yeah. Okay, they accept that they accept the discovery, right? But they refuse to accept the source of the discovery. They think, and Narby gets into this. He says the ability to actually put these things together among all of the plants of the Amazon is the probability is minuscule. And they've done it. And how many different medicines and discoveries have they made like this? It's so many.
For all sorts of diseases.
Exactly. So the question then becomes, what anthropologist, and Narby perhaps could be doing it, but who is willing among these experts to take them seriously enough to want to consume enough ayahuasca to, like he describes these medicine men as being able to consume incredible amounts of ayahuasca through this very rigorous training. And it's through this rigorous training and ayahuasca consumption that the plants communicate with them and tell them things. That seems to be the next step. Who is willing to undergo that very, very severe education in the jungle?
It's definitely, it's very unlikely to be a Westerner probably that goes the same path as the Amazonian shaman. I think, didn't he mention in the book that there's only one person that went through the shamanic education or traditional shamanic education that was actually writing a book about it? I think there's only one. But I mean, he was not the only one that whose eyes were opened by getting into the shamanic rituals in the Amazon. I think there was another anthropologist who is was completely dismissed afterwards. For him, it was also very difficult to speak about what he actually experienced and what he started to think, because I'm risking my professional career, because everybody would not only understand me but would dismiss me, and I would lose my credibility. in the Western world. So I think
well,
maybe there's many
that,
more
there's
out,
that going
out
on
there that are actually thinking very similarly and just don't and are afraid that they cannot be open.
Well, that's one reason why this recent interest in psychedelics and MDMA for treating soldiers who have post traumatic stress.
Yeah, I think that was approved now in Texas, right?
I think so.
PTSD with MDMA, yeah, for veterans.
Yeah. I've got a friend who wants to get onto it. He's here.
Okay.
He got blown up twice by bombs and shot by a sniper. Yeah, very serious. But yeah, these things are. This will be great, but this will also be good for research funding because many of these guys would probably like to study this stuff, but they're so scared of their, like you said, losing their positions and not getting funding for other things if they get involved in it. Pollan gets into that in his book as well.
Did Pollan get into only therapeutical things, or does he also see the spiritual potential of psychedelics?
Well, it's very interesting. He gets into the spiritual potential, but he's not a spiritual kind of guy.
Yeah, like
what's interesting?
Us. I mean, even yeah.
Well, this is. I kind of was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking, like, for one thing, what do we mean by spirituality? This is it like quartz crystals and like incense, and that's what a lot of people tend to think it is. But I think it's actually something, or they think it's religion, or it's something you do on Sunday. It's God. It's something that's not physical. I think the real advance of Narby's book and what Pollan is talking about is to show that there's no break between what is spiritual and what is physical. They're not separate. They're in fact the same thing. And Narby, by bringing up DNA, DNA is this coded language that exists in all things, and it's never changed in the history of life. It's a very shocking thing that DNA has never evolved. It's the same language from 1 billion years ago as it is today in anything. In any living thing.
What I found even more interesting about his DNA hypothesis is that it's supposedly you can measure frequencies coming from the DNA, and maybe it's even receiving other frequencies. So maybe the DNA is the one thing that is actually the thing that is triggered when people take mushrooms and say, "Oh my God, I felt like a big an integral part of the world, and I had to hug a tree and whatsoever. I'm so connected to everything." Maybe there is just some trigger that makes the DNA very active, and all of a sudden you're kind of interacting or communicating via the language of your DNA, the frequencies of your DNA, with the outside world, including other living creatures. This is.
I think that's what Narby is essentially saying.
This found I very interesting.
I think if you read, there's some confluence of DMT and DNA and all these things. But what's interesting, at least for us, is we're finding, and perhaps science as well, is finding its way back to spiritual questions through material scientific method. They're coming up to the boundaries, right? Pollan in his book gets to these boundaries where he's like, I'm not sure if I'm really doing science or not, or it's feeling or what it is. I think that's the kind of spirituality, the spiritual questions that arise. So science can get to these regions because the ayahuasquero who says that he communicates with the ayahuasca in the jungle, you could tell him about DNA all you want and frequencies and DMT. Like he's like, I'm already there, dude. I don't. Your science is far behind where I'm doing. So I think because we're so primitive, we've become so primitive because of our Western ways and biases. We have a very hard road to get to where those people are with their ability to communicate with things and feel this connectedness. But I would say that is spirituality. And it's a mistake to think spirituality is not something physical. It's just that's to reduce it in a way. Its beauty is that it's everything, and to get to that everythingness, you can do it with science, but you've got to push science. I think also, and I was thinking about this the other day, is that philosophy also can get into those regions. Philosophy makes the same mistakes that science does, and it's kind of born out of the same biases and the same ground. And if you read guys like Zhuangzi, who I've been recommending to you, he basically uses reason, and he gets to the boundaries of reason and then jumps across, and he gets to where you would if you were taking ayahuasca, essentially. So there are these pathways back.
Yeah, but
you can use Western notions to get back to it.
I know you don't like that. I try to approach spirituality or the for us not understandable things scientifically. I know that you didn't like the fact that I did this very much when I described what I think caused the loss of my soul, which was basically a chemical inactivity of hormones and neurotransmitters. But I'm pretty sure now that this was actually the case. But it felt to me that I'm completely unspiritual. I felt like a dead person. So, I mean, much worse than in a normal state. But I was never a spiritual I never considered myself a spiritual person anyway. Just recently I discovered, okay, that's interesting. Maybe the pandemic put me in a position that made me experience things differently. I don't know what caused it. But
I was wrong. I was wrong though. I need to make the point though that I was wrong in saying that I felt that spirituality was something that shouldn't be reducible to neurotransmitters. I don't think that at all now. I think like when you say, oh, someone does breathing techniques and they trigger DMT and that's how they're able to have these psychedelic experiences. I think that that's a way to undermine psychedelic experience and say it's caused by breathing techniques and anyone could do it. No, that's not true at all. The actual experience is what is important. And you can tell people who have had, even people who are atheists who've had spiritual experiences while on LSD, Pollan gets into this, that they just had a bunch of chemical things happen in their brain. That doesn't invalidate the experience. They feel changed. The point is that you are a changed person. You can try and reduce it to chemicals and neurotransmitters, but you haven't dealt with the actual experience, right? You felt like you lost your soul. That was the experience.
Yeah, I call it a non-experience. It's not something that you actually experience because you're not a person actually anymore. Anyway, no, but for me, I think it's a very good way actually to understand what spirituality is. Just because my approach I try to make it as scientific as possible because I would not consider myself an esoteric person, even though I'm getting into these things more and more too. But just because I try to explain them to myself with scientific terms and DNA and DMT and endogenous and whatsoever, it does not mean that I don't think once you reach the state, however you reach the state, it is not a mystical, a spiritual experience. It may be, maybe our existence, there's more about our existence than what I thought for the first 39 years of my life. Because I basically did not believe in anything. I think everything is just an evolutionary coincidence. And this is something I don't believe anymore. I don't believe anymore, yeah. So yeah, I definitely think maybe all this DNA within us, all these hormones, the transmitters, the molecules that are causing certain emotions and feelings and whatever, shivers and visions, hallucinations, mystical experience. Maybe this has a deeper meaning which cannot explained in a scientific paper.
Well, right. And I think when you do finally get around to reading Pollan's book, I think he makes that point, which is that science has to look at the results of these experiences and how lives are changed and take that seriously. Because if the therapy of allowing people who are dying to feel better for a long time about dying and not be depressed, that clinically actually is a good therapy. It works better than any other pills. You just give them LSD, have them go on a trip, and then they feel better and they're more comfortable with their coming death. That has effectiveness. And so you can't deny the effectiveness. But I also think is that you can't deny the effectiveness of the Egyptians using spiritually guided technology to move 80-ton blocks. You can't deny that. And you can't deny that Amazonian shaman are communicating with plants and making incredible medicines, discovering medicines.
Yeah, no, of course, no. All things are true. So there's just
but it's not just the
different approaches how to reach another level of consciousness.
But the idea, though, is that science can appreciate these discoveries. And these were not discoveries made with technology and science. They were made as spiritually guided discoveries, which is very different. You know, that was one of the points of that abandoned podcast, which is that what if the spirit and spiritual concerns were now the guiding thing for technology? And
that would be beautiful. I mean, that's the reason why I'm so happy about all of these Canadian penny stocks psychedelic companies, that they are now trying to get into the therapeutical industry for whatever depression and eating disorders, you name it. They do trials on this. I'm very happy about this. I'm even invested, but it doesn't go far enough for me. So I would love to have actually applications of not necessarily the psychedelics, because I believe that there is other ways to reach these levels of consciousness too. But it's a first good thing that they are doing, that they are having a therapeutical approach. But I would love to see a more spiritual approach, because I mean, humanity at its current state is in a very, very bad shape. We are poor in spirituality for whatever reason. I think there's plenty of reasons why we are so crippled spiritually.
Oh yeah, there's that word. There's that newly invented word we were using for a while.
Despirited. I think you came up.
We are despirited.
Yeah.
It's a great word.
Yeah, but even I told you, what I even liked better was when Friedrich Schiller, the German from 1800, 1700 something, he used the term, and now the world is becoming degodened or something, and he was very afraid of.
What's it? What is it in German?
Entgötterung. It's such a beautiful word.
Entgötterung. Degodened.
Yeah. No, but actually, I think we are just spiritually crippled, and that's the reason why we're so destructive. That brings me back. This is how I explain what is the ego. What makes us behave so destructive, which only serves our personal goals, better bank.
Well, we were talking about this, and I was, in trying to discover what we mean by spirituality. I think we're much closer to what we're trying to talk about, like this intersection of things happening in neurotransmitters and DMT, but also spiritual things, like you feel connected to things. So
yeah, but what is causing this feeling of connection? And this brings me back to Jeremy Narby's DNA theory. Maybe becoming an egoist or a narcissist in the worst case. Maybe this is the result of having a DNA that is not interacting with the surrounding world and other living creatures, because it's not triggered by a certain level of chemical activity in your body. So maybe
there is that notion that the ego would get in the way of a trip, right? Like a bad trip could be the result of you fighting. What is it? The description of not if there's a stairway, you should take the stairway. If there's a door, you should go through the door. Like if people resist doing that in those trips, that's an expression perhaps of ego and not wanting to open themselves to the connections that are possible. And but what do we mean by ego? I mean narcissism. We were talking about it earlier. Is the ego the same for non-Western people as it is for Western people? And I'd say it's very different for us. We have this very different sense of ego. But is ego really even the right word? I think there are illnesses of ego, and they're expressing themselves. But the ego itself, I think, can be empty. I don't think the ego has to be a negative thing. Just like the human stomach is not a problem in itself, it's just an organ, but you can fill it with problematic foods that will poison your body. And I think the ego is sort of like the stomach of the spirit. We were talking a little bit about that earlier. I don't know what you think about that idea. Ego as the stomach of the spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to define the ego properly. I think everybody has his or her own definition. I don't think that a person, even in the most healthy environment, surrounded by nature and nice people that are generous and hospitable and friendly and polite and whatsoever, and you're part of a community that is working on the same things and living together, all of these people still have something that could be considered an ego. It's just not an ego that was intoxicated by a toxic environment. So yeah, I can imagine an ego is something very neutral when you're a newborn baby and then you grow up and all of a sudden there's all these things that are coming towards you and that make you a person that is more focusing on yourself than the rest of the world. And I think that's a vicious cycle. Capitalism is the result of this, but also enforces this even more. So we become more and more destructive to ourselves every generation and to the environment because we are trapped in this vicious cycle.
Well, the ego is the illnesses of ego are certainly encouraged by capitalism. You're successful in a capitalist system if you can be more more narcissistic, more ego driven.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, probably 90% of all top managers and professional sportsmen, or the best of the professional sportsmen and politicians, they are probably very, very, very extreme narcissistic people.
Well, I mean, look at any of these companies. If you want to rise in the company, you need to make yourself look good, and the people around you that you are competing for promotions look worse than you. So you want to. There's no selflessness. You're not giving to anyone. You want to hinder others and advance yourself. And so there's an implicit dishonesty and separation between people, which is the opposite of the kind of spirituality we're talking about, which is this honest openness and giving to others, which is egoless. But at the same time, and this is one of the ideas that I had about the ego, which is this basic root ego, which is just basically the will to survive. Like, you choose to not let yourself die. I think that's an expression of ego, but a very basic one. Like there are all these stories of the Inuit. They would share food with people who were starving, but they would only share food up until a point when they realized that the person who was starving was still going to need more food. The Inuit would just leave them because the Inuit still needed enough food for themselves. Food they understood as being common to all. Like, if you had food, you'd share it with anyone. There was no like, this is my food, this is your food. No, everybody's food is everybody's food. One day you're the hunter and you might get something good. Someday I might get something good. It's always shared, but it's only shared to the point where your life can be affected. If your life you're going to lose your life by giving, you don't give anymore. You let the person die.
Yeah, but if you are probably not skilled enough to hunt in the Amazonian jungle, as a Westerner, I'm pretty sure these Amazonians would feed you for the rest of your lives because they just don't care. So what the Inuit did is they had to probably because of the food supply, the animals that can be hunted there, it's not in big quantities available. But if the same thing happens in the Amazon, I think you can live there for the rest of your life and nobody gives a shit.
There was enough food. You're right. There's enough food there.
And here in the West we don't do it even one day because food can be measured by grams and kilograms or whatever, and by money. I think money is a very big, a major reason why things are got so out of control when it comes to human values. If something like money was never involved, I think we would share so much more than it's a very bad replacement for trading goods, because everything can be all the time measured somehow.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you bring up the trading aspect to it and the money aspect to it as being very disruptive to these pure, more spiritual ways of living, where people are living more connected with each other and with nature and doing less harmful things to the world around them. Trade is really an issue. Trade is the one way they are able to destroy a lot of these indigenous people. They would offer them, metal goods and things like that, guns and stuff, and it was better for the hunters. And the hunters began to say, "Oh yeah, this technology is good."
I mean, isn't this?
But to get this technology, they needed to slaughter a bunch of animals to get their skins and pelts to trade for the weapons. So then they killed the game in their area.
Yeah,
and
the bison almost went extinct because of the trade, right?
Well, right, you had the white people killing the
bison.
Also
the natives, yeah, who got paid in alcohol and things like this just to deliver some bison fur or meat or whatever.
Well, it's one of the dirty secrets is that the Indians, the North American Indians, were doing some of the same slaughters that the white people were doing for reasons of trade and goods that they wanted.
Yeah, but probably only after the Europeans arrived in North America. Before that, I'm pretty sure they had a very healthy relationship with the animals that were on the grasslands.
Oh, they did. Yeah, for sure. There was no reason to slaughter them all like they did to trade for something. But they weren't spiritually prepared for these technologies and modes of life, And I remember we were talking also a little bit previously about people that in the West had demonstrated spiritually that they were prepared, and there's only one group, and that's the Amish.
Yeah, they just resist basically. I mean, they just take advantage of a very minimal quantity of the technology that would be available to them. So they actually acting very wisely.
Well, they're a group. They are a group that asks the spiritual question of their technology every time. They ask how it affects their community and their values.
Yeah. But what are they using nowadays?
They don't use smartphones.
But do they have running water, or do they have where do they get the water from?
Yeah. They have.
I mean, water. This is already very highly sophisticated technology. Comfort and convenience, I think, is also another reason why people become crippled spiritually, or why they become more ego focused, because if you have to push yourself to do something all the time, we talked about it. We have this German expression, which is the innere Schweinehund, the inner pig dog. If you have to fight this inner pig dog on a daily basis, probably you're a much stronger person when it comes to being more egoless. You're definitely more egoless person when you have to deal with discomfort and inconvenience much more often.
Well, that's part of the spiritual training that I've been working on. If I'm not taking ayahuasca and doing these things, there still is preparation you can do and discoveries to be made. And I've found that work itself, physical labor, a difficult exercise, these things that are hard to do. This is also a way to make spiritual connections and to better yourself in terms of your virtue, to lessen the ego.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? I am curious about how your chemical activity looks like, or how different it is when you're doing these spiritual battles, when you do the work better and more perfect than needed, and you do the things that the other ones don't want to do, and you just force yourself to do all the shitty stuff. So when you're doing these battles, I would like to know how your, for example, DMT level at this moment, and endogenous DMT level at this moment is in your body. And I think already, because you also mentioned to me probably for a year that you noticed some changes which you, I think, describe kind of as spiritual changes. I think already you with the your diet and with the workout, and now with the physical labor which you try to do as good as possible, or better than good as possible. I think you already reached a state of chemical activity which is above the average level which you had before all of these pig dog battles.
Well, I will say that I feel really good after doing these things. The funny thing is about a lot of these hard things to do, like to be completely honest all the time, to always tell the truth, to never do anything, to not accept responsibility, to do the job less than perfect, to do something less than the standard, to not pick something off the ground that has been dropped, to not fix someone else's work when it's wrong, to shy away from all of these opportunities actually is destructive in a virtuous sense, but it also makes you feel good to do these things. And so I think there definitely is a chemical reaction going on. I wouldn't feel good otherwise. But at the top, but beyond all of that, I think I am getting to a point of some sort of connectedness. I've mentioned this before, and this seems crazy, but I'm seeing evidence of this again and again and again, where I can, by being connected in this way, by being honest and trying to
connected to
purify
what?
myself virtuously.
Connected.
I don't know. It's like to all things. It's like this feeling.
And this brings me back to Jeremy Narby's DNA hypothesis. So maybe by doing all of this, your chemical activity is already above the average, which results in a more talkative or interactive DNA, and the frequencies going out from your DNA and that are received by your DNA